Hi, my name is Andy Van Zandt. I'm a professional board game developer. I worked for TMG for about 5 years, and now I do freelance development for several different companies. We're in the middle of the coronavirus stay-at-home thing, and so I thought it might be interesting to evaluate some older games through the modern development lens. And today I've chosen Tigris and Euphrates, and I chose it because it's an already successful title, right? Like, you already know it's a good game. It used to be number 1 on BGG. There was even a digital implementation of it you could play there for a while. I also chose the Mayfair version, so this isn't even a version that you buy on store shelves anymore. So I shouldn't be affecting anybody's bottom line. And really, it's important to say what I'm saying is not criticism, because this, for its time, at the time it was put out, had very good production value, very good graphic design, and obviously good gameplay, and it appealed to its target demographic, which is maybe one of the most important things. And so these aren't really criticisms; these are just what I would do differently if I handed this product and had to remake it for a more modern sensibilities. The first thing, and maybe one of the longest things I might end up talking about, is the box. And a box is very important for a game, because it's what will sell the majority of the copies that you sell. Like, sometimes companies operate off of word of mouth or nostalgia or things like that, but on average, when you're planning a product, you're planning a product based on the box selling the majority of the copies. So all the stuff having to do with that is more important than you might think. So we've got a box that's, when you pick it up, it's got pretty good heft, and that's because there's actually a lot of components in this, and that's a good thing, because people, when they pick up a box off a store shelf, they make a subconscious evaluation of it. They assign a value to it based on how big the box is and how heavy it is. If you got a really big box, but it feels like there's nothing in it, you will devalue the contents, even if it says $20 on it. And if it's a coffin-sized box and it feels really weirdly light, you'll be like, oh, I think I might be misspending my money here, right? So heavy box is a good thing. The next thing you'll notice when you pick up a box is the cover, right? Or maybe even before you pick it up. So this cover has a good illustration. It's a nice illustration. It doesn't illustrate one of the things that I think is most important, but it does say conflict on it. So this is a conflict euro. This is a directed aggression euro. So Brute and Blood Rage are also in that category. So there's definitely an audience for that. At the time this was put out, just Euro was niche enough without needing to delve further. But at this point in time, the game market is big enough that you want to specify who your audience is. So when you're making a product, you want your audience to be able to pick out exactly, this is for me. This is the kind of thing that I would like. And I wish that the cover, the illustration conveyed the conflict part a little bit better. And that's not something that it would have had to have done at the time. Similarly, civilization is a much more loaded term these days. This is 15 or 20 years later, or whatever it is. And while Civ games existed back then, nowadays if you call something a Civ game, you bring to mind very specific parameters, and people will get disappointed very easily if you don't meet those parameters. So I would probably not have these words, because people tend to gloss over words like this. It's good to have them, because otherwise you don't have that information here. But I would convey the civilization theme without saying the word civilization, because it's a loaded term. I would display the conflict in the illustration, and I would get rid of this border. So the border is a big thing. It kind of identifies it as an older title. If you look at other older titles, you'll notice that we've got a border here with all the elements kind of attached to this border. And like, if you look at other games too, we've got a border here, we've got all the elements attached to this border, and that frame that you're putting things in has function. There's reasons to do it. It's actually a very safe choice. A lot of mass market games still kind of do that. But in a comic shop, if you go into a comic shop today and see a game with this heavy of a frame around it, your brain will probably assign it a certain age. You will probably think it's slightly older. And on top of that, maybe more importantly, a lot of times when you see games with frames, those aren't the games where you're like, wow, that was a super cool cover, or you're not often drawn to them. You're not like, you're not thinking that that's a standout cover that wows you, and that's kind of an important thing. It's a useful thing, at least. As a contrasting example, we've got a more modern box design here, and we've got a floating logo, and then we've got anchored elements over on the sides. A lot of times you'll see something like this with either the anchored elements, maybe a bar with elements anchored on it, or you'll see everything floating. So this kind of gives you a good idea of both of those kind of things: a floating logo and then anchored elements. So I would get rid of the frame. I would full bleed it, probably wrap the edges as well, and display these a little bit better. When you pick up the box, you'll turn it around. Oh, actually, let me pause. So another thing about this cover is that it's landscape instead of portrait. That doesn't matter a lot to consumers. Consumers are okay with that, but some stores will make a planogram. They will say this goes here, and this goes here, and this goes here, and this goes here, right? More often mass market stores. And that's with the idea that these are faced out, and they expect a certain amount of profit per square inch on that planogram. And when you've got a landscape orientation, you are taking up more square inches of shelf space than if you were in portrait orientation. So for consumers, that doesn't matter as much. When you pick up the box, on the long edge here, there's that, but there's no core information. There's no player count, age range, things like that. So when you pick up a portrait orientation box, a lot of times you'll look at the edge, and that information will be there. When you pick up this landscape orientation box, a lot of times people will still look at the long edge, and so I would put that information here as well. I wouldn't do that if this was a portrait orientation. I would just put it on the long edge, but since it's landscape, I would have done it on both sides, and that's really the only criticism I have about the sides there. So the back of the box is good. It starts with a shot of the components. You've got a shot of the board. You got tiles. You've got silk screened wood in there, which is actually really good production value for the time this was released. So a component shot is a good thing. We've got the culture, conflict, civilization repeated, and we've got a blurb. And this blurb doesn't talk about mechanics. And normally I like to talk about mechanics, have part of it be theme, part of it be mechanics. This is all theme, so it's all fluff. But that's a personal preference and not a necessarily this is better thing, because some games are better served by just explaining the theme. I would say for a Euro style game, having a little bit about mechanics in there is probably better for the audience. If this was a dungeon crawler or a heavily thematic game, some might say, I would be more okay with entirely fluff. So I'd have a little bit of mechanics there. We've got a components list, which is okay. I would have consolidated some of these because, for example, 158 illustrated civilization tiles, 8 catastrophe tiles, 1 unification tile. Those are all just square tiles, right? That could be consolidated, and people don't really just like read through this very, very scrutinizingly. They will kind of glance at it and get an idea of what's inside, and it's a good idea to be like, oh, check out all this stuff, but you could have just as easily been like, yeah, there's like 170 tiles or whatever the number is in here, and X number of pieces of wood instead of this. So made it a little bit more concise, so you get that impression a little bit faster. And even worse than that, down here, we've got the revised edition contains a new 2-sided game board, 4 new civilization buildings, and a new advanced scenario, and that's buried. Most people aren't even going to get through both of these paragraphs. Even the few who get down to this list are going to assume that there's nothing of value below this, and so this is useful information for making a sale, and it's way down at the bottom, and it's kind of lost there. So we open up this box, and I actually So let me talk for half a second about this insert here. We've got a plain white insert. This is a riser. It's meant to keep stuff from rattling around. There's this, and then there's some punch boards sitting on top of there. And people a lot of times are like, oh, I just threw out the insert. And it's like, okay, cool. Because this is meant to stop stuff from rattling around during shipping. And when people pick up a box and it rattles, that gives the impression that that there's something wrong, like it's a broken machine sort of thing. It's another weird subconscious thing. So you want to reduce your rattle, and I'm not saying just a little bit of rattle is fine, right? Every box is going to have some, but if you hear something sliding from one end of the box to the other, that creates a bad subconscious valuation. So this white insert, it's not for storage. And basically anytime you see a white insert, it's not for storage. Who cares if you throw it out? It was never meant, even if it's got multiple wells in it, if you can use it for storage, great. But that was not its purpose in life. It cost a few pennies to throw this thing in here to make sure the components don't get damaged during shipping, and so that the consumer doesn't hear a heavy rattle when they're picking it up. So that's that insert there. So let me talk about the board here. So we've got a nice 6-fold board. I'm just going to fold in 4 here so that I can actually fit it on this table. Maybe. There we go. So we've got a nice 6-fold board here, you can clearly see important spots for where stuff starts. The river is nicely delineated. It's a nice illustrated river. Importantly, it only goes into the squares in which it exists. So sometimes you'll see maps that have some element like that. It's an illustrative element that means something for the gameplay, and they'll have it poke over into a square because they didn't want to mess with how pretty it was, and then they lose some graphic design value from that. So this is nice in that it's illustrative, but they actually stayed in all the squares in which it goes in. So it's very clear for the gameplay elements. And there's kind of a textured topographical map thing here, but really the thing I don't like about this is that to your average person looking at this is just a big mess of yellow. That's not very attractive. You're not going to walk by a table and be like, wow, what game is that based on this board? When it gets covered up with bits and stuff later on, it looks a little bit better, but this board is not something you're going to hang up on a wall. It's not going to attract customers, sort of thing. So I would have asked for, while it's very good, very clear graphic design wise, modern sensibilities, I would want it to pop on the table, to have table presence, even before you put the components on. And so I would try and flesh this out a little bit more and not have it just be a mess of yellow, a cool river, and then the meaningful spaces. The only real illustrative elements we have is this border. The border is nice, but it's still not, nobody's like, wow, that's an awesome looking board because of the border, right? Like, it's something that should be adding to the rest of the elements here, and I think you could do that without detracting from the clarity of the graphic design. This is a double-sided board for different player counts, I believe, and that's nice because really that costs very little extra besides the art costs. Depending on how you're having your board made, that costs very little extra to have the backside be an additional thing. So whereas 2 separate boards, like often a folding board is the most expensive component inside of a box, so having a separate one would be prohibitive, but having a double-sided one is the exact opposite. It's very nice that it has that. So that's the board. So we've got player screens here. These player screens are great. So in this game, players are not represented by colors, they're represented by symbols, and so we've got symbols on the player screens. They tell you whose pieces belong to whom, even if all of their other indicator pieces are out on the board. Your screen is still going to show you that. and more importantly, it's got a player reference on the back with some turns sequence, and the two hardest things in the game are internal, and I say hardest, they're not hard, but they are the hardest part of the game to understand, are all spelled out here on your player A. And more games should do that, like just a really brief turn structure. It's like a skeleton upon which to hang the other information. It makes teaching a game so much easier, and it makes picking up a game that you haven't played in a while so much easier. So having that on the screens is great. So what else do we have here? We have a bag. The bag is very nice. It's got a drawstring, so you can use it for storage. It has a very wide opening, so even big hands can get in here and get to the pieces. So your bag this is a good bag. We have a variety of tiles, and these tiles are nice in a couple of ways. They represent color, and they have a secondary indicator of the color, which is their illustration, and that's a bonus. Unfortunately, the rest of the components don't do that, and that'll be a criticism. I'll touch on that in a second. But we've got a second indicator of color. They're nice. They've got cool illustrations on them. The backside has utility too for in-game when you build monuments. You flip them over, flip 4 of them over, and you stick a monument on top of it. So these tiles are nice. They're very functional, as well as being pretty. You have wooden cubes in a few different sizes, which are victory points. These could have been tiles at a very similar cost, and that's what I would do today. I don't know if at the time that was the case, but today these could have been small tiles with point values on them, rather than having like 1s and 5s, I think they are. That way you could have secondary indicators on them of color for color blindness. If nothing else, so even if I wanted to keep it cubes, just because it's nice to have cubes, right? Like they're a little bit nicer as cubes. I wouldn't have done red and green. That's the easiest thing to just not do. I would have done probably black, white, light blue, dark red, probably as the 4 colors, and that will satisfy a whole lot of different colorblind scenarios, and if they had done that, I would have no criticism whatsoever about the color choices here. But that's neither here nor there. When you've got a game with a whole lot of components that are color coded, like if you've got 8 different colors that matter, it's a little harder to pick out which colors to do things with. When you've got only 4 or 5, it's pretty easy. We've got monuments and buildings, and these are actually very nice. These add to the table presence that the board takes away. So you've got a board, and you'll have a bunch of tiles on it covering the board, and then you'll also have these super cool monuments sitting on top of tiles, and so that gives you table presence. That gives you a little bit of wow factor. And for when it was printed, this was extremely nice. So I think that these are a standout feature of the game, that they did that with wooden pieces rather than tiles, and I definitely would have kept something like that. So those are your monuments and your buildings. We've got leader tiles, which are these discs, leader tokens, which are discs with the silk screening on them. Again, we've got a very nice production value, very good for table appeal. Again, the colors are an in-game mechanical thing and not the player. The player is the symbol. So this is a player bag that has the bull in it, and like, my only criticism is the same small colorblind criticism that I would have gone with different colors. And since they were silk screening these, they could have had a secondary indicator on them. Actually, something else worth noting though is when you've got tiles on a board, So let's say, and these are not the right example, but they'll do for my purposes here. So you've got tiles on a board here, and this token here is essentially a tile too. It goes next to things and connects to your kingdom. At a glance, because this is circular, it makes this look separate from this, and that's not exactly how that works. So I might have made this octagonal or square, just so it made it feel more cohesive. I also might have stained the underlying wood, had it be dark wood with the silk screening on top, so that the lighter wood doesn't get lost in the yellow. But I think that's less relevant. If you change the board, then that criticism goes away anyways. This lighter wood will stand out against a slightly more illustrative board. And so I think that just leaves the rule book here, and we've actually got two rule books. We've got the full rules, and then we've got this game overview book, and that's very nice. And what this for is, it's not really for a new player. It's for a player picking it up who has played before but needs a refresher, and this helps you get that very quickly. Like, I'm sure it'll help a new player a little bit, but really its purpose is for players who have played before, who just don't want to have to reread the whole rule book, and they've got that for it. And it's very nice to have. And then I'm going to criticize it slightly because it's a separate piece, and it's not a fair criticism, right? Because my criticism is about cost here. It would have cost slightly less to include it in the main rulebook, and had it be either the back page or the back splash, and I think they could have easily done that. So they thought it was okay for their bottom line to have it be separate. And anytime you've got a separate piece, you've got two separate pieces here, you're not only paying for the printing, but you're paying for the collation. So it's such a minor thing. Like, it's a bad criticism, sort of, but it's the way I would have done it, which is what we're talking about here, is to condense it a little bit, have it be on the back here. And speaking of condensing, my single biggest criticism of this rulebook is this decorative border here, because it takes up a lot of space overall. When you add this all up, instead of a 16-page rulebook, we could have been a 12-page rulebook probably, and we might have been able to just tack this guy onto the end and like picture this information here, except right here. And so I think it's pretty easy to get the bulk of that quick reference stuff onto the back of the rulebook here, especially if you kill the decorative borders on both of these. So that's my biggest criticism, because the game is good, the gameplay is good, and the rules that explain it are actually very well laid out. We've got your components and your preparation, your setup stuff. We give the object of the game and a brief overview of what's going to happen, and then we flesh that out. And I like that approach in general, is again giving people a skeleton to hang the information on, and then fleshing it out. I could of course go through and nitpick like little tiny things. I might have found places to be more concise, or places that needed to be a little bit more thorough, but really this covers basically all the things you need. The information is all there if you look for it, and it's laid out in a way that makes sense. Like I mentioned earlier, the hardest thing for the game is the internal and external conflicts. They're not that hard, and they are pretty well covered here. So I have very few complaints about this rulebook as a whole. So much so that like if this was another game, I might have been like, oh, this needed to be here, like I was doing with the box back, like kind of more picking it apart. So this is a pretty good rulebook. My biggest complaint is the border, and the other thing is not really a complaint. It's just I would do it differently now, and not necessarily do it differently then. So that's Tigris and Euphrates by Mayfair Games, and it's a good game. I think let me close by talking once more about setting expectations for the product. So is a directed aggression Euro style game. You've got a specific market. That market exists and has tons of people in it, and you want them to know that this game is for them. And so if you were to redo it today, that's what I would try and make the product convey as well as possible. Because your setting expectations matters so much, because if somebody goes into a game expecting one thing and they get another, they will call the game bad, and that'll be an unfair criticism, because the game might be great, right? Like if you go into this expecting this to be a regular Euro, you'll actually sit down and you'll play the first half of the game and you'll be like, yeah, this is awesome. And then you'll get to the part where somebody does an external conflict with you and just destroys a big swath of what you built, and you'll be like, oh, this game is bad. I don't like this. I don't like what just happened, right? And it's not that the game is bad. The game is obviously great, right? Like it is number one on BGG. It might not be for them, and it'll especially not be for them if they expected to get something different. So managing expectations with your product in general is a really big, important thing. So that's anything else I did would be through that lens. I want to manage that expectation as good as possible, as well as possible. And so I guess that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope that somebody found this interesting, even if it was only little parts of it. Talk to you later.